Welcome to Pete's Property Podcast, brought to you by Buyers and hosted by Pete Wargent, buyer's agent, finance and real estate expert, and all-round property guru, plus published author. Join Pete for 30 minutes as he chats all things property with a new guest each week. Learn practical tips from the movers and shakers in the property industry and well-known personalities sharing their property journeys.
G'day, welcome to this week's episode of the Pete Wargent Property Pod. I'm thrilled this week to welcome back onto the show Australia's leading futurist, Steve Sammartino. He came on way back in episode 12. And I think of all the podcasts we did, that was the one that got the most positive feedback. So today we're going to do part two. Welcome, Steve. It's great to have you back on.
I'm excited to be back.
So, Steve, today we want to talk about the future of city living because I guess as everybody's talked about ad nauseam over the last couple of years, we've had a lot of changes in the way in which we've lived, some of it forced upon us and some of it, I guess, an acceleration of some of these trends that were already underway. So just a brief bio. Steve is Australia's leading futurist, keynote speaker, one of the world's most engaging and thought-provoking speakers on the future of the world, spoken to over 200,000 people, wowed audiences all around the world from Asia to Europe, Africa, USA and China. And Steve, what have I missed there?
You've missed my 3 best-selling books, my national TV show on Channel 9. Gee,
and,
there's a lot of stuff.
A TikTok star as well these days, of course.
Oh, so, no, burgeoning. That's an experiment, live experiment. Live experiment, that one.
We'll give you a little direction at the end of where you can go for more on Steve's content and books and so on. So, well, you're based in Melbourne. In Sydney and Brisbane at the moment, I haven't been to Melbourne for a little while, but the traffic is unbelievably bad at the moment. And I guess to some degree, people are steering clear of public transport a little bit, maybe because of the social distancing. But I'm interested to get your take, because I know this is something you've studied a lot. What is the future of auto transport going to look like in our cities? Obviously, we're getting more electric vehicles at the moment, and hopefully that will make some of the streets a bit quieter. But if we were looking forward, say, 10 or 20 years, what would you expect to see?
Yeah, so I think all of the large auto manufacturers now regard themselves as mobility providers. I think that's the first thing. There's going to be quite a few business model changes. The business model of mobility in Australia and many Western countries, certainly the US, has been buy a car, put petrol in the car, the oil industry makes a lot of money, and you drive your car everywhere and you try and find somewhere to, park it in the city or at work or an office, and you come back and you live in suburbia. Really hub and spoke has been the way that it's kind of worked with arterials coming in. But I think the real shift is going to be that we will use a larger variety of transportation devices through our days and our weeks as time goes by. I think autonomy will get here with cars, but it'll be a lot longer than we think. There's this weird movement with technology where often when a new technology arrives, it can solve the first 90% of the problem really, really easy. And then we have this, what we call an arrow flight projection. We think, well, based on the fact that we have solved 90% of the autonomous car problems in 9 years, we'll solve the remaining 10% in 1 year. Like that's but it gets exponentially harder to fix that. I think we'll see autonomous zones for driving. You might be on a highway heading past Sydney or from Melbourne to Geelong, and you'll have a sign on the highway that says you are now entering an autonomous zone, and you can have an autonomous vehicle there. And I think that we will see more mass transit do a lot better. The idea of trains, the idea of pods and hubs that we hop into to go around the city. I think that Sydney and Melbourne and most of the cities will have, and they're moving towards this, London does it as well, via taxation. I don't think we'll be able to drive private cars in most CBDs around the world within a decade. I think they'll be reconfigured.
Yeah, well, we've definitely had that in London with the congestion charges in recent years. It's interesting you mentioned there about the 90% of the problem and then that difficult to solve last 10%. I some years, well, probably a decade ago, I was previously a car owner in Sydney, but I was living in Pyrmont and wasn't really driving into the CBD. And we went through a period of using like a car sharing service, which kind of worked okay. But then there was the final 10% of problems that somebody else would have put a scratch on the car and it gets attributed to you, or there's not one available when you need one. And then we still own a car in Europe, but these days I kind of rent a car when I need one. So we never quite got there with the car sharing thing. In the future, you mentioned there's sort of the idea of transport hubs, and I know Sydney has been talking about moving to this three cities model where you've got Western Sydney and Parramatta, and then I guess Sydney and North Sydney as the third hub. We've seen loads and loads of investment in recent years in rail and public transport infrastructure. We're probably moving towards a model of less commuting to the CBD. So do you think people will still cluster around train stations and transport hubs as the cities grow from sort of 5, 6 to 7 million?
Yeah, I think they will still cluster around transport hubs, and people will still cluster around cities, because cities are kind of like little possibility factories. There's so much chance for serendipity and entertainment and people crossing paths, but we will cluster for different reasons. We'll cluster because that's where the entertainment and the people are and the living and the experiences. We used to cluster there because all cities were built on a river or a waterway. That's where we transported things. That's where we got our water from, and that's where the factories were. And then the factories are there, so we build offices there. Now that all gets reversed out. We still cluster in the city, but not because the work's there and we have to live close, because no one had a car when factories came, and we walked there or rode bicycles or horses. We cluster around cities because that's where the entertainment is, the football, the show. That's where we get together. That's where we eat. The cities will go through a transition. They won't become the ghost towns that everyone's afraid of. Oh, we need to get people back in the city for work. No, we just need to reconfigure cities so that people want to hang out in there, and reconfigure a lot of the cubicle farms into places where people can live and have more entertainment and more reason to be there. I don't think it becomes like a working thing all the time. It'll be about 50-50. But people will still cluster around cities, cluster around transport, because I don't think mobility is going to go away. Humans are natural travelers. I mean, hunters and gatherers. We've been traveling our whole lives. It's what we do.
It's interesting there. You mentioned as the city as a place to go for entertainment. I'm just thinking back to before Australia Day weekend this year in January. I was just hanging out in Sydney for a few weeks, and during the day, the CBD was a total ghost town because a lot of the banks and the financial services firms had people working from home. But then if you went to somewhere like, I don't know, Taronga Zoo, or if you came into the city, there was nightlife going on. Just thinking back to London sort of 20 or 30 years ago, and how the square mile was always completely dead on weekends. But specifically for the actual CBD areas, are you seeing a need for potentially less office space going forward? And if so, what happens with that space? Is it going to be international students or serviced offices, or do you have tech hubs where people come 2 days a week? Are they going to be much quieter?
Yeah, no, I think that they'll be reconfigured. There's going to be a massive reduction in office space. In my view, at least 50% is going to go away. And that's going to be converted into a multitude of things. I think we've already got enough student accommodation pretty much in most of the Australian cities, certainly. But I think it's going to be reconfigured to residential and different type of office spaces. One of the things that I say is that houses now look more like offices and offices look more like houses. So when you think about what an office looks like in the future, it looks like your house. You can already see it. I mean, the Silicon Valley companies did it a long time ago, where their campuses became a little bit like universities, but now a little bit more homey. Most of the offices that have been reconfigured by top-notch architects are making them very homey in their setups, little enclaves to work, places to catch up, to eat, to do things. They're not like battery farms for hens, laying corporate eggs. It's not like that anymore. And so the opportunity, I think, in cities is to reconfigure office buildings into residential buildings. And then when you have more people living in the city and not necessarily going to an office, there's a greater need for entertainment, other things that might otherwise be outside of the city. And you'll get that vibrancy during the day and at lunchtime and in the morning. Usually get with office workers, but just with people who live there. And then at night, like you say, it's the same in Melbourne. 20 years ago, Melbourne used to be really dead on the weekends in the CBD. Now it's pretty alive. And that's because people want to hang out. But I think you'll see a big reconfiguration reconfiguration of offices into living spaces. And I think the offices that do exist will have less people per square metre, but be far more expensive fit outs. And you're even going to see modularity, where there might be 3 companies that share one really cool office space. A bank might have had their own space and have it half empty. You might have a bank, a manufacturing firm, and a law firm all share the same funky office and get that cross-fertilization, but they're only 1/3 of their workers are coming in. So the office has full weekly occupation, but with different people from different firms. And that's the kind of imagination that I think good property designers and architects will bring forward.
That does make sense. I think, I guess I've spent far less time in Melbourne than yourself, but certainly in Sydney, we've seen that over the years with it's becoming, particularly towards the Chinatown end of Sydney, so much more of a 24-hour city these days. If you went into town on a weekend or a Sunday, it used to be almost completely derelict on the weekends, but now there's a lot going on. And it's funny you mentioned the battery farm sort of office layouts. I can remember even some of the relatively modern offices on Liverpool Street. They were literally set up like battery cages with people had their own little pod and so on. But there's definitely a move away from that, which is a good thing, no doubt. On the point of homes looking more like offices, that's something we've certainly seen a bit of over the past couple of years with clients coming to us and saying, look, I want to buy a place, but it has to have an office space because whether through choice or necessity, we're having to work from home a lot more. Do you see that as an ongoing trend? And if so, potentially a bit more of a spread out population than what we had been getting used to?
Yeah, I think so. I think that spread will happen because we've realised we don't have to go in the office via this crisis. I mean, we had a far greater spread before the 70s and the 60s. It's been well documented, the decline of regional areas in countries like the UK and the US, the Rust Belt in the US, and in Australia we had vibrant cities that really declined, that were really big and vibrant. In Melbourne, it was Ballarat and Bendigo, and they were really big sub-centres, and they declined. But they're sort of making a comeback, a regional renaissance. So I think there'll be more of a diaspora of people spreading out because they can. With high-speed rail and only needing to come into a CBD within a couple of hours, that'll come back, and people's homes will need to change shape. You will need to have an office. It's funny, we put in gourmet kitchens and gourmet bathrooms, and now it's going to be like a gourmet office. You're going to have like a little recording studio. You're going to have a little a psych wall and a white wall to do video. You're going to have high-speed satellite internet. You're going to have all of these things that you would once expect in a company. So you have like a really good eating space and cooking space and soft furnishings and all. So you sort of almost get like they both lend from each other. I think we'll reconfigure our homes a lot to reflect this.
Do you want to save on buyer's agent fees? You could save thousands with Buyers Buyers. As Australia's most extensive network of buyer's agents, we can lock in highly competitive prices. Plus, our national network of buyer's agents are some of the best in the business. So get the Buyers Buyers advantage and talk to us today. Call 1-800-975-051 or visit buyersbuyers.com.au.
The regional renaissance, I've seen something similar happen in Britain as well over the last couple of years. I think certainly the parts of the country where I spent a lot of time in England, there was a big decline because there were far fewer agricultural workers, but now loads of people moving out to places like the Cotswolds and so on. I think in Australia, it seems to be, particularly the coastal locations seem to be the big draw card. Sunshine Coast, I guess Geelong down your way, and Central Coast. In fact, all the way down the East Coast, it's just been booming. More so than in Europe, the coast seems to be a really big draw card in Australia. Steve, I wanted to talk about career reinvention that you talked about in your TED talk, which we'll just come on to in a second. Just before we do that, I had one other point I wanted to cover off because that's like a whole separate topic. Just on the subject of retail, because we have a number of investors in commercial property. You mentioned the sort of change in demand for office space, but what about in the retail sector? I guess casting my mind back, there was a big change where the high streets like Paddington in Sydney, they were the most expensive real estate, but then the Westfields came along. I guess we've seen another change in the last decade or so towards online retail. So how is the traditional bricks and mortar retail going to shape up going forward? Is it going to be more of an experience-based sector where people go not just for the shopping, they go for the food and everything else? Or how is it going to compete with the online surge in purchases?
Yeah, I feel like this really fits into the idea of cities being reconfigured for people. And because of that, what we used to have was entertainment and shopping for goods used to kind of be a little bit separate. And the shopping centres did a pretty good job of putting a cinema in there and I guess for fast food, those food courts. But let's just elevate that idea. Let's just call it various forms of entertainment, whatever they may well be, high-end entertainment, high-end food. And not the nicest kind of example, I guess, in some ways, casinos do that in an interesting way. That's the kind of thinking that cities need, the kind of thinking that casinos do, just without the gambling. You don't need the gambling. And I do think that shopping, I don't see retailers actually having the decline that a lot of people think about. You can pretty much get whatever you want online now, and you have been able to for pretty much the last decade at the best price. And there's still this physicality where we like to go and touch certain things and look at them. A lot of things that I buy that are repeat purchase, so I know what I'm getting. Like I bought a new iPhone the other day and I just bought it online and got it delivered because I knew exactly what I wanted. I didn't have to go to the Apple store. If you're competing in retail with a homogeneous product at a price point, that's what you can't do because you'll never have the cost infrastructure to compete. But if you're in retail where it's experiential or people want to touch it or hold it or do some of those things, I think retail will become stronger, a little bit more experiential and entertainment based, but I still think shopping for goods will do pretty well.
Yeah, I think some of the department stores had this idea years ago. I think I remember Marks and Spencer putting a bar in there because there were so many there's so many blokes who are just bored going shopping. And it's like, you go and have a beer and, your partner can do the shopping. And I think they could kind of see where things were heading, but it's maybe just, as you said, elevating that idea so that shopping is not just a place where you go and traipse around. You can also get your food or have some other entertainment or something for the kids to do.
The idea is we're not going shopping, we're going to the city. It's actually, if the destination is the reason, then the shopping happens. If the shopping is the reason, then you might not go.
Yes, and that makes sense, and it certainly sounds more appealing to me than being dragged around the shops just to go shopping. And I think for retail property investors, they probably need to factor that in. Retail is an experience, not just a place where people go and shop only. So, Steve, I recently rewatched your TED Talk where you talked about the concept of the 4 S's, spear, seed, spanner, and now silicon, i.e., we've moved from, as you mentioned, a hunter-gatherer sort of race towards being sort of agriculturally based. And then we had the Industrial Revolution in my part of the world in Yorkshire and parts of England. And then we've now moved into the silicon phase where we've got distributed technology and tools. And I guess most importantly, work can be done somewhere other than where the work or service is actually needed. So talk to us a bit about that concept and what does that mean for the future of work and the future of jobs? And I guess for people who are thinking about switching their career, how can they use that information?
And I'll summarize those 4 words by saying, historically, the major tool of the day has always defined where we work and where we live. So with the spear, we're hunters and gatherers, we live where the herd is. We follow the herd. We follow the seasons to get the nutrients and we're highly mobile, but we're defined by the tools. When we were an agrarian society, we developed the first little civilizations. We mastered agriculture and we grew food and we lived there. Once industrialization came on board, before the Industrial Revolution, like 99% of people in the world, their full-time job was food production in some way. It's crazy to even think that. You're like, wow. And now it's less than 1% of the world's population are directly involved in production of food in the Western world, that is. So that tells you how much of an impact industrialization had. And that's when we all moved to the cities en masse. And this entire thing around what we make and build and the goods that we consume became the world we're in. But again, we had to live and work where the tools were. That's why offices exist. Offices exist because photocopiers used to be $100,000 and useful. And we had to centralize the tools of the office as well, not just the factory. But silicon's different. Silicon creates mobility. And what it does is it allows work to change places. And the simple example is an email, right? I do the work here and then I send it to you, Peter, and then you've got the work. Well, we did that. So you sent me a few ideas that you're thinking about. You're on the other side of the world and here we are talking for free. And we're both working right now. We had to schedule a time when we could sit together and do it, or we might try and record it on an old school phone and wouldn't probably work properly. You sent me the questions, I've got them. So we're doing it right now. And that's what silicon does. It allows work and location to be separate. So in terms of work, it's going to take companies a long time to get their head around the idea that you don't have to watch someone for them to do their work. And if it's office work, companies that don't embrace it will have a far smaller pool of people to choose from. Companies that say you have to be in the office, they're going to find out the hard way that most people don't want to be forced to go there. Now, you might want to go there 2 or 3 days a week, and I know I would, but I wouldn't want to be forced to go there. So it's going to change work radically, right? It's going to take the pressure off cities, the pressure off infrastructure. One other thing that silicon does is it actually enables us to turn bits into atoms. So I'll explain that. That's a kind of an idea I've been flirting with recently, is that for the first 20 years of the digital revolution, we took physical things and turned them into data. You know, we took a record and we made an MP3. We took a video store and we made it Netflix. You know, we took Encyclopedia Britannica and made it Wikipedia. We took Yellow Pages and made it Google, right? We took physical things and we turned them into information. The next phase is turning information into physical things. So we'll take artificial intelligence and build cars with robots in ways that we've never done before. We'll use 3D printing to build buildings, you know, which is information being turned into physical objects. And I think manufacturing will return to high-cost labour markets like the UK and Australia, and we'll see manufacturing return radically. And also as a result or a reflection of what's happening with global supply chain issues and wars in Ukraine.
And what you said there about employers having to offer the flexible working arrangements, I think we've already seen that in Sydney. Some of the big tech firms, they've practically had to offer the talent the option to work flexibly or remotely, because otherwise people simply wouldn't come to work for them. And maybe that's increasingly going to be an ongoing trend as people come to expect not being required to be in the office for 5 days a week. And if they want to be based at the Gold Coast or somewhere else, then increasingly that will be possible. And I suppose the flow on from that is that in the future, people with the requisite skills, well, you won't have to work for one employer. You could potentially sell your skills. You don't have to have one job, one employer. You could have multiple income streams, or you could be a freelancer. And in a sense, it is quite good to diversify, because that way you're not reliant on the one employer.
It's so funny. You know, I wrote this in my second book, The Lessons School Forgot. The first rule of investing: diversify your portfolio, right, and spread your risk. And then what do we do with our primary incomes? Most of us, when we leave school, we put all our risk with one investment, one employer. Like, I had 81 customers last year. If I lose one, I've got 80, right? And this is one of the really interesting things. And I think companies will be smart to not want people full-time. Like, because you're always thinking about the job you're in and the company. And if you're a career-minded people, which I know the listeners would be, and I am, and I'm investing-minded and you are, I'm always thinking about whatever I'm working on for a client. They just don't get me for the hour of the day. They get me all the time because I'm always on. So I can see this future where you work for, you know, a manufacturing company for Monday and Tuesday, and property investment firm Wednesday and Thursday, and you do freelance stuff on Friday. Like, companies who would embrace what were historically full-time jobs into part-time, that could be an incredible way to get diverse thinking, experienced people who are polymaths, who are Renaissance people, who have a breadth of experience. And this whole factory industrial mindset of a singular model, I think it stifles creativity. And I'll take it a step further. I wonder if being an employee is a 200-year anomaly. Because up until the Industrial Revolution, well over 90% of people work for themselves. They were all freelancers. There was no such thing as an employee unless you worked for the government or the army, right? And factories made employees. There was no such thing before that. And I wonder now that the friction of employment has been removed, whether or not we'll become informational freelancers or digital craftspeople.
Yeah, that does make a lot of sense. Almost like going back to piecework, but the piecework these days is potentially delivering an important professional service or whatever your skill set happens to be. Steve, one of the things to finish up with, coming back to the real estate theme. In recent years, I've been living at Sunshine Beach and then Noosa. And these have been places that have really boomed because of, the acceleration has happened because of people, I guess, moving up from your neck of the woods largely. I guess what people always want to know is, okay, well, you've mentioned the sort of the future of city living may not be so closely tied to the CBDs. But so where are going to be the sorts of boom towns of the future where people might be able to head to? You know, if people can commute from further away in Queensland, I guess places like Townsville or Bundaberg come into the equation. But certainly in the last couple of years, it's been this sort of lifestyle areas of Queensland, which makes me think that maybe the Whitsundays or Agnes Water in 1770 and those kind of places will become more popular. But thinking of, say, Victoria, New South Wales, Western Australia, where are the sorts of locations and towns and cities that you think might benefit from the more flexible working arrangements?
I've got a bit of a crazy one. One thing that I think property developers have been really clever at for, I think, a very long time, if they couldn't get the space next to something that was beautiful, they would invent it. So the things that I throw up in my mind is, they'd make a lake or a golf course and do a development around it. So make it worth going to where those things kind of didn't exist. Make things a little bit more beautiful. I think there's going to be a real advancement with free and clean energy and things like desalination plants and bringing water in from the coast into desert-based areas and literally creating new types of cities. You see it a lot in China and you see it in Dubai in the Middle East where they've got excess capital. But I don't think it's out of the reach of countries like Australia to take a desert and make it green through desalinated water. And remember, energy is going to be close to free within 10 years. That's the exponential improvement in renewable energy. You put something there like a surf lake. There's this thing happening in Queensland called the surf lakes where they've made this beautiful lake with waves in it. And you can just see developments happening in places like Alice Springs and regional areas that aren't quite beautiful, using technology to make them beautiful, to invent the thing that they don't have Sunshine Beach does have. So I think some areas that have small populations that aren't beautiful but have a bit of space and are within a few hours, maybe even further out where you have to fly in, some of those regional areas, I think you're going to see some really interesting stuff when capital comes from overseas and with all the land that we've got. And once it's established that people can live and work anywhere, that's where I think you're going to see some really interesting things.
Yeah, well, I suppose we've sort of seen that a little bit over the years of the Gold Coast where waterways get created where there isn't really a waterway, but one gets built and then, you know, those properties can be sold as waterfront, so to speak. And I'm thinking maybe 10 or 15 years ago, China famously had its ghost towns where there was recreations of London and Big Ben and all these other things. Look, I guess that was maybe a bit ahead of its time, but you can certainly envisage sort of lifestyle locations with a new lake and other facilities that could easily be a factor. I noticed recently the Reserve Bank of Australia put out a paper on the impacts of climate on the sorts of locations that might become uninsurable. So I suppose that's
coastal,
things,
beachfront.
One of the things that people will need to factor in if they're thinking of waterfront property. But
it's funny, I thought of that as recently as 5 years ago, when I bought my farm in Geelong. I made sure it was more than 50 metres above sea level.
I think with insurance premiums going up, I think in Brisbane they used to talk about floods being a 1 in 50 year event, then it was 1 in 10 years, and now it seems to be every second year. So I think it's definitely front of mind for people. So that's something to factor in if you're looking for a remote or a tropical location, is that obviously climate's going to be a very hot topic in the media over the decades ahead. Steve, we could no doubt talk all day, and we haven't even gone on to talk about electric vehicles investments, but that might get me in trouble with the lack of AFSL on this podcast. So maybe one for another time. But It would be
Yeah,
remiss
no
of me
worries.
not to point people to your amazing TikTok account, but where else can they go if they want to subscribe to your newsletter or check out your TED Talk? Where's the best place for people to check
The best
you out?
place to go is just go to stevesammartino.com and sign up to my blog there. If you just go to the blog, you can sign up. And I do an email newsletter on Friday mornings. It's just a tech essay of something that is usually applicable no matter what your work is. And of course, you totally got to follow my TikTok experiment where I give investing and business advice, mostly motivational, which I don't normally do. I normally talk about tech and what have you, but as you know, we've discussed, Peter, I do a bit of that. So that's my latest experiment is TikTok, which is Steve Sammartino. If you're into something more than watching people do dances.
I must admit, I'm not a big TikTok subscriber, but I definitely do subscribe to your newsletter, and it's one of the very few that actually check out and always make the time to read, because as you've seen today, Steve is always thinking differently and thinking ahead. So, Steve, thank you so much for joining us, and I'd love to have you on again in the future to check out some of these evolving trends.
Love that, Pete. Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to Pete's Property Podcast, powered by Buyers. Don't forget to subscribe and join us next time as Pete chats all things property with a new guest. And just a reminder that the information provided in this podcast is general advice only and doesn't take into account your personal financial situation or needs. You should always consult a licensed professional to discuss your individual personal circumstances.